There is a discourse on whether or not Michael Myers is brother or not, which is Jamie Lee Curtis's character. That becomes discourse in the book. Grady Hendrix is very much deep into this fandom, and I can appreciate that. Hello, my fellow bookish witches. Welcome to Witchy Reads. Before we get chased by a monster and get turned into our own version of a final girl, please make sure to like this video, and if the spirit moves you, subscribe to my channel. Today, we are going to talk about The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. And I actually have a physical copy of this book right here. And as you can see, annotated to hell. This was a book club selection for the month of October. This is the second time a Grady Hendrix novel has been selected for my book club, and this is the second time that I have not enjoyed it. I am also an avid horror movie fan, so this intrigued me because of that. I find the concept of the final girl really intriguing, and if you're not sure what that is, the final girl is the final female protagonist of a horror film that survives past everybody else and usually ends up killing the monster at the end. Surprise. I like that recently there has been this pop culture movement to expand on that trope, in that there are films out about the final girl. Now there is this book. I know that there is another book about the final girl. I don't remember the author for it. I'll have to put it up here. It is definitely a concept that intrigues horror fans, and I am definitely among them. I find it fascinating. I think a big part of my intrigue for that came from the movie Cabin in the Woods. It was the first time that it was a significant part of the movie where they called it out.
But she's still alive.
How can the ritual be complete?
The virgin's death is optional as long as it's last. Main thing is that she, suffers.
The other Grady Hendrix book that my book club has read in the past was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I was the only one in my book club who really did not enjoy that book. I just wasn't a fan of the story. I feel like the synopsis had me anticipating one story and I got something completely different. Also, I wasn't a huge fan as far as how the characters were written, and I feel like a lot of that has transferred to this book as well. I feel like it was very much the same situation where the synopsis gave one type of story and then I got a completely different kind of story. I really did not enjoy the characters in this book at all. I might just be not a fan of Grady Hendrix books. I think it's a very clever book cover. I like that it is a folding chair that you would find at a lot of like community support groups, and that it's covered in blood, which very much indicates this is a horror movie and it's about the final girl and it's a support group. So the cover gives you everything as far as what the book is supposed to be, and I really liked that. Ultimately, what I was hoping for was a book more focused on empowering women and being about a group of women that uplifted each other and were there for each other. And then in the ensuing chaos of maybe having to face their trauma or face their monsters again, that they all worked together to overcome it. And that's just not what we got. Instead, we got this rambling, jumbled support group that isn't very supportive. The women are very catty with each other and tear each other down.
What? We've been scammed! Jenny, what do you see?
Oh my God. It's just not something I found fun to read or uplifting as a woman, especially if I was a woman who had suffered trauma and was going and actively seeking support from a support group, that this is the image that I'm coming away with from this story. It's just not a good look. The few characters I did enjoy were either very rarely in the book or just outright killed in the beginning of the story, which was really a bummer. Mainly because I think that the protagonist that we ultimately follow throughout the story is not only not interesting, but just a bad person. All of the women in this support group are very similar, and not in the, oh, we share a traumatic experience kind of way, more so in the, hey, what was your name? What is your story? I'm confused. Where am I?
Who are you?
It was really hard to distinguish the characters until each of their backstories is told. That is way further in the book than you would probably realize. I feel like what Grady Hendrix was trying to do with this book was make a statement about the trauma that women face, particularly against violent men. Instead of making a commentary about that, it started to feel like he was making fun of women who experience this kind of trauma, and that maybe they are over exaggerating, they're overdoing it. Overall, it was really hard to pinpoint what exactly Grady Hendrix wanted to say with this story.
I'm just as confused as you are, Kevin.
The red herrings that Grady Hendrix used within the story for the horror elements were not convincing, and in fact seemed to almost highlight the actual twists that came down the line. I actually was a bit of an outlier here in my book club. I was the only one who caught on as to what the twist was before it happened, which I found odd. Honestly, I think Grady Hendrix could have done without having that particular scene, and you would have saved maybe that twist. I had suspicions prior to that scene, so who knows if that would have changed anything for me. That scene for me just confirmed what I was already feeling. This doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Just because something is spoiled for me or I figure something out early doesn't necessarily sour my experience in reading the story. However, if your twist isn't strong enough or if your story isn't strong enough, it literally just becomes an exercise of getting to the end because you already know what's about to happen. And that is how I felt in reading this book once I figured out the twist. It made the climax of the story for me very anticlimactic. I will say, as a horror movie fan, what I did enjoy about this book were the horror movie references as well as the titles of each of the chapters. I thought that was really clever. I'll show you. They're good. They're good. Here is chapter 1. It's the Final Girl Support Group. And then if you go to chapter 2, it's the Final Girl Support Group 2. Each chapter is the title of what would be the subsequent sequel if this was a horror movie franchise. And I thought that was wickedly clever. The Final Girl Support Group, The Return, or The Bride of the Final Girl Support Group. I will give Grady Hendrix that. I thought that was really funny. The killer's got a chainsaw, boat hook, butcher's knife, and this girl's got zip. No upper body strength, no mass, no shotgun. All she's got is good cardio and an all-American face. I'm going to do a quick rundown of each of the women in the support group as well as the movie franchise that her story is pulled from. None of the massacres that have occurred with these women are original. Grady Hendrix has pulled each and every one from an already existing popular horror film. We have Adrian. Adrian's story is similar to Friday the 13th. Her killer was a cook at her camp who was getting revenge for his son who died there, and he blames the camp counselors. We have Danny, whose story is similar to Halloween. For her, it was her brother rampages through her neighborhood, kills a bunch of people. Marilyn, similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There is Julia. Her story is similar to Scream, and in fact, her monster is labeled Ghostface in the book. Heather, whose story is similar to Nightmare on Elm Street. Her monster is called the Dream King. Then we have Lynette, whose story is similar to Silent Night, Deadly Night. Silent Night, Deadly Night is the only movie out of the list of movies that I have not personally seen. I actually had to Google it just to figure out what movie it was because it wasn't ringing any bells for me. Lynette is the protagonist. She is who we follow through this story. Those girls make up the main support group. There is also another final girl named Chrissy. They consider her a traitor because she ultimately ends up empathizing with the monsters and turns her back on the support group. I couldn't really figure out what movies were similar to Chrissy's story. Looking at some Reddit posts, a lot of theories have come out saying that Chrissy is a mix between Saw and My Bloody Valentine. The My Bloody Valentine reference comes from the fact that it happened during her prom, and then Saw because there is a character in Saw who ultimately turns on the victims and becomes the killer herself. Each woman has profited off of her story by selling her story to movie studios and creating movie franchises. So within the book, there are also horror movies that are based off of their stories. Sometimes you need the money more than you need to live with yourself. The story proper starts off really depressing as we follow Lynette or Lynn through her day getting ready to head to support group. She's in this 1-bedroom apartment. In her brain, around any corner lurks a monster and she needs to be ready to defend herself. So she is getting ready for her day, and during this process, she hears about a tragedy at Camp Red Lake. This piques her interest because Camp Red Lake was the site of Adrian's massacre, which, if you remember, is the Friday the 13th girl. See, even I'm having a hard time remembering still. There is another massacre, a recent one, and she is watching this and she sees that there's this new final girl. Her name is Stephanie, this 16-year-old, and basically Lynette feels bad for her because now her life will never be the same. Fair, that totally makes sense. Camp Red Lake is no longer a regular camp. Adrian took the money that she received from her movie franchise and bought the camp and turned it into a woman's retreat, a safe space for women who have suffered traumatic events, and has actually actively helped a lot of women. Honestly, just hearing about Adrian, she sounds like she is the best final girl, quite honestly. We follow Lynn to the support group. Here is where we see the utter disdain that these women have for each other. And it is so disheartening, especially with what I was hoping this book would be. They are calling each other names. They are being catty. They are being mean. Ultimately, they just start outright yelling at each other. They all but can't stand each other. And Danny, who is the Halloween girl, comes out and says, look, this is probably going to be my last group. My partner / wife is dying of cancer. I don't want to waste my time coming to this support group when it is doing nothing for me. And I would rather spend the remaining days that I have with her with my wife. And you know what? Fair. If therapy isn't doing it for you, or maybe you just need to find a new therapist, what Danny is considering doing is there's nothing wrong with that. Lynn immediately feels a panic attack coming on because she can't allow the support group to fall apart. She needs it.
I'm not going nowhere. This is a support group. Y'all supposed to be here to support me, and I don't feel supported right now.
But instead of vocalizing that and saying she is the one that needs it, she puts it all on another final girl, Heather. She claims that if group falls apart, what will Heather do? She's going to relapse because Heather has a drug addiction. Julia looks at Lynn and goes, no, we don't come here for Heather. We come here for you. We know you're the paranoid one. You live in a cage. You're the one who has psychological issues that have not been dealt with. We come here for you. We get a lot of internal monologuing from Lynn. It's weird that the other women are claiming that they are coming here for her, especially since she feels they have never made her feel included because they don't view her as a real final girl because she didn't end up killing her killer. From what I understand of her story, it's not only only did she not kill him, but she made no attempt to. That's not really made clear early on. In addition to this, Dr. Carol, who is their therapist, psychiatrist, is really bad at her job. This has been going on for at least over 20 years, I want to say, and no one has gotten better. Heather has had many relapses. Everyone is sick of each other. Everyone is dealing with their trauma in their own way, but it doesn't seem this group is really helping, especially Lynn. Nothing has really gotten through to her and nothing is helping. Isn't the point of therapy that one day you don't need it anymore? The support group ends and we follow Lynn home. And when I say that, I mean we follow this long diatribe, pages length, of how she gets on different buses, takes different routes in the vein of wanting to avoid being followed. Who's following her? Who knows? This is her paranoia. I didn't have an issue with showcasing that this is something she does, that this is part of her trauma. My issue with this scene came from the fact that it went on for way too long. There is a point when you are trying to make a point, it becomes a joke. It feels like you're making fun of it. That is what I started to feel after such and such pages of describing the different paths, the different streets, the different bus stops, how she looks at people's shoes, how she has to monitor them, how she can't keep her mind on monitoring the people around her because she's worried about what Julia said at group. And so she has to keep switching buses because she loses track of who's on the bus with her. It goes on and on and on and on. It would have been beneficial to cut this scene shorter so you wouldn't run the risk of making it sound like you're making fun of women who are dealing with trauma, and probably do something similar to this in order to feel comfortable going out of their house. Out there in the world is a nonstop murder party, and if I make the slightest mistake, I'll wind up dead. There are also strong implications through the character Lynn that all monsters are men, and all men inevitably can become monsters. I don't like this train of thought. Again, it's coming off to me as a joke, as something to me made fun of. It is poking fun at women who would be rightly scared of being around men because of past trauma. It is screaming for people to just go, oh, not all men. I have not suffered this kind of trauma. I don't know. This is just how I am interpreting this scene. Murder is man's attempt to steal birth from women. We make children, they kill them. We create life, they create death. It's the way it's always been. We arrive back at Lynn's apartment, and this is when we get a better description of how she lives, the precautions she has taken to avoid being killed. We see the extent of her neuroses in dealing with this trauma, and it's a lot. She does have a pet plant that is a pepper plant. Nothing wrong with that. There are plant girlies out there. Where it gets a little weird is that she speaks to the plant telepathically because it's all in her head. It would be one thing if she was holding conversations with the plant where she would talk to it and then it would respond, but like she would be the one responding. So it was like she was talking to herself. That I feel would almost make sense and not come off as cringy.
Yeah, people will beat you and curse you and cheat you. Every one of them's bad, except you.
Oh, thanks, buddy.
This is her telepathically talking to this plant, and the implication is that she legit can hear the plant talking to her, which makes me think that she's got some deeper mental health issues that need to be addressed but never are addressed. This scene is a little too much and unnecessary. Have the pet plant, have it be that you talk to it. Don't imply that the plant is supernatural and can also talk to her telepathically. It almost makes me start to wonder if Grady Hendrix had any sensitivity readers for this book. That group of people would probably be hard to pin down and have them agree to do something like that because you don't want to re-traumatize anybody. However, I feel because he is not a woman and has not experienced the level of trauma he is talking about, that he just doesn't fully understand. It's coming off as someone who is either being intentionally obtuse or ignorant to what they are talking about. One of the final girls, Julia, arrives at Lynn's apartment. One thing I didn't mention is that due to her experience, Julia is in a wheelchair. She arrives at Lynn's apartment. Lynn, at some point in the past, gave Julia her address in case of emergency. Julia is there demanding to talk to Lynn. Lynn doesn't answer the door. But then a few minutes later, Julia returns, and this time there is a man with her who is wearing a ghost face mask and has a knife to her throat and is threatening to kill her if Lynn doesn't open the door. Why these characters thought this was a good idea, I don't know. Especially if they know Lynn at all, and Julia should know. Lynn goes and gets her gun, and then she opens the door, and then immediately opens fire. The man in the mask is a character called Russell Thorne. He is a reporter who has worked with some of the final girls to help tell their story. He and Julia thought this was a good idea because they figured it would be the only way to get Lynn to open her door. I guess they were right about that, but gosh, are they lucky that the mesh gauge stopped her bullets, because Russell would have been shot. Julia is there because she is worried about news that a book about the support group is being released. Someone knows about it, and it basically has all of their secrets. What the support group does and what they have discussed there is now going to be out in the public domain. They are worried about that, specifically because it would be a way to dox them when they have been in hiding for so long and trying to move on with their lives. Before they can decide what to do, hail of bullets just comes ripping through Lynn's apartment. Everyone gets knocked to the floor. Julia ends up getting shot. Russell gets shot too, and then he tries to go and save Julia, and then I believe he is shot again and killed. Lynn is not shot and doesn't even attempt to try to help Julia, and instead just gets out of there. She feels instant regret in doing that, but then also in her mind she's like, I'm built to survive, I'm a final girl. It was a shitty thing to do, let's be real. She doesn't know if Julia survives, so she just runs. She has escape plans. One of those escape plans is a car, so she goes to the parking garage, gets to the car, and before she can even get close to the car, she notices that the tires are slashed. Someone knows her escape plan. Then she takes public transportation and goes to a storage locker because this is also part of her escape plan. As she is approaching her locker, she notices that the lock on it has changed. So someone has been there and has been inside her storage unit and has replaced the lock. Now she's scared because none of her plans are set to work. The only person she can think to call is Dr. Carroll. Dr. Carroll comes and gets her and offers to have her stay at her house. Lynn immediately balks at that because she says, you have men in your house. And Dr. Carroll says, my sons? Dr. Carroll has two sons, Sky and Pax. Sky is 26, and it took a bit for me to come to terms with the fact that he is 26 because Grady Hendrix does this really weird thing in referencing Dr. Carroll's sons. He always mentions them as her kids. And so when you call someone their kid, in my mind, I instantly think of someone who is a teenager or younger, not someone who's almost 30. Sky is 26, but Pax is 8. Lynn reluctantly agrees to go stay with Dr. Carroll. This is where that whole mindset of all men can become monsters comes in, and it's really incorrect and cringe. Lynn starts hyper-focusing on Pax and the things he does as an 8-year-old child.
Trick or treat!
Starts implying that he is predisposed to be a monster. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to look at a child and just go, you will be a monster that kills, that murders people. I didn't like that implication. Trauma does weird things to people. I am not saying that it doesn't. I just feel that a woman wouldn't look at a child and say, I gotta look out for you. You might kill me. Lynn stays with Dr. Carroll for about a day. And then Dr. Carroll starts talking about involving the cops. And at that point, Lynn is like, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to involve the cops. My previous encounters with the cops have not been great, so I don't really want to deal with that. So she enlists the help of Sky to get her out of the house. And this is where the character development for Lynn just starts to kind of go all over the place. For someone who is so hyper paranoid, specifically about men, to ask for the assistance of a man, trust him, get in a car alone with him, and allow him to help you doesn't make sense to me. I'm not saying she shouldn't do it. I think looking at a man and just saying, like, oh, you're going to be a murderer is weird too. Because that has been established for her character, it doesn't seem right that she would do that. Skye helps her, gets her out. She manages to get back to her apartment. The reason why she is doing this is because she wants to get the hard drive off of her computer, because we find out that the book that Julia was talking about was actually written by Lynn. And I just want to make this clear. Lynn did write this book, but she had no intention of publishing it. It is made very clear in the text that this is more of a cathartic exercise for her to help her grieve and deal with her trauma, and actually seemed, based on what she says, to help her. It was essentially her diary. I feel like the other characters took it way too seriously. And I get it. The initial reaction is to be like, oh my God, you wrote this and you were planning on publishing it. But the minute that Lynn says, no, I was doing this for therapy, there shouldn't be any further accusations. Yeah, I guess you could be upset about the fact she called you a bitch in her diary, but to be mad to think that she was going to publish it, that needs to end. You need to have a conversation about the other stuff, but not about that. After leaving Skye, Lynn decides she wants to go someplace where she is guaranteed security. She figures the best place to do this is to go to Marilyn's house, because Marilyn is the wealthiest of the final girls and lives in a mansion with like high-end security. So she goes there and she basically ends up in the pool house at Marilyn's place. And who is there waiting for her? Heather, because Heather's halfway house burnt down and everyone is blaming Heather for it. This is where Lynn starts to put pieces together as far as what is happening. The fact that the massacre happened at Camp Red Lake, that Adrian was attacked again, that she was killed, that someone shot up her apartment, that Heather's halfway house burnt down. It feels like someone is hurting the final girls to all gather, and she's not sure why, but she's pretty sure that part of the why is that they want to finish the job and kill them. Of course, because Lynn is the most paranoid of the group, they all feel like this is a little far-fetched, that it just seems too ridiculous that one person would have gotten this all together and created this entire plan to get rid of the final girls.
Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay?
Julia did survive the shooting and she is in a hospital because Lynn feels that somebody is after them. She says, well, me, Heather, Marilyn, we're safe. We're at Marilyn's house. We have security. Julia's in the hospital. Someone will be watching her there. Oh, where is Danny? Danny lives on this ranch in the middle of nowhere with her wife. Then we find out that another man has come forward in the massacre that Danny dealt with and has claimed that he was actually the killer and that she killed her brother for no reason. When the cops came to question her about that, she put up a big fuss because she didn't want to leave her wife, Michelle, who was dying of cancer. The cops really didn't care and they arrested her and they took Michelle and put her in a hospice care. So now Lynn realizes Danny's in police custody. The only person who is vulnerable right now is Michelle. And granted, while she's not a final girl, she is connected to a final girl, and if she's just in a hospice facility, she is vulnerable. Lynn convinces Marilyn and Heather to go with her to go check on Michelle and make sure that nothing bad happens to her. They get to the hospice center, they see how horrible it is, and Lynn knows that Danny and Michelle wanted Michelle to die at their ranch. So Lynn concocts this spontaneous rescue escape attempt with Michelle. They get her out. Unfortunately, she dies on the way to the ranch. When trying to figure out what to do with Michelle's body, Heather ends up with Marilyn's phone and calls the cops on Lynn.
Police? I need to report an emergency.
Because while this has all been happening, another thing that has come to light is that the old Detective Garrett, I believe is his name, has come forward saying there is new evidence in Lynn's massacre case because it is now implied that she had a sexual relationship with the killer who killed her family. And she is wanted for questioning because Heather and Marilyn really don't believe Lynn's harebrained theory, and Heather is out there for herself, much like all the women are. She calls the cops on Lynn. Detective Garrett shows up and they take Lynn away to the LAPD for questioning. What follows is another scene that completely irritates me as a true crime fangirl, because this is now the second book where this has happened. Lynn is taken in for questioning and immediately she says the magic word. She says lawyer, but they refuse to get her a lawyer. She says it multiple times, refuses to get her a lawyer. She then ends up in this weird type of cell. It's a bright room. It's got like a slab for a bed, and there's a plate glass window where the cops can view her and she can see into them. They post these letters that she wrote to the killer. That's when it's revealed that yes, she did have a correspondence with this killer, but no, she didn't have a sexual relationship with him. The letters that imply that are forgeries. She lets us know that. On top of putting these letters up on this glass, the cops stand behind the screen and set up a Christmas display because her massacre happened on Christmas Eve. They sing Christmas carols. This weird form of torture. Where are we? This is supposed to be the LAPD and this is so illegal. Quite honestly, I'm a little irritated that the end of the book didn't end with Lynn suing the hell out of that police department. First off, she wasn't under arrest. She was there for questioning, so she could leave whenever she wanted to. She also asked for her lawyer and didn't get her a lawyer. And then she gets put into a cell. They're doing these weird Christmas torture things. This entire scene is so bizarre. Maybe Grady Hendrix was trying to make a commentary on the corruption of the LAPD or just police in general. Who knows? But this is to the extreme. This just seems so out of the realm of reality that it was hard for me to keep up. It really took me out. It was almost like he was trying to make this a campy horror film when the reality is that he was making a true crime story about trauma. Or I don't know, maybe he didn't know what he was trying to do, but he's doing a combination of the two. And because he has included this true crime element that deals with women's trauma, having this scene just felt weird. One of the deputies is apparently a super fan of Lynn's killer. He comes in and tries to kill her for some kind of fanboy notoriety. Detective Garrett uses that instance to take her away from the LAPD because he feels she is not safe there, and that proves it. Says that he is going to take her back to their town. They get into a car together and drive off. This is where he admits that he knew the deputy was a super fan and was probably going to pull something like that and was just waiting because he was already planning on using that as a reason to pull her out. This guy is just awful. To compound the awfulness, we find out that the backstory with Lynn is that when her killer attacked and murdered her family and murdered her high school boyfriend on Christmas Eve, this detective, Garrett, is the one who showed up first and killed the killer for her, which is what makes her not a legitimate final girl. This guy came in and saved her. Fine. But then you come to find out that this guy was in his late 20s, I want to say, when the original crime took place, and Lynn was 16, 17. He basically used her to get famous because of her story and then sleep with her. He groomed a 16-year-old who was super vulnerable, who had just lost her family and had suffered some major injuries and trauma.
Punish!
This man, I hate him. Ultimately, though, he confesses to Lynn that he knows that she didn't have anything to do with her family's murder and that the letters that they had uncovered included some forgeries and that she never really slept with the killer. She then relays to him all that's been going on and what her theory is, that someone is trying to round up all the final girls and kill them. She is trying to figure out who would be behind this, who would be the mastermind, who knows enough about the group that could pull this off. And ultimately, Lynn has decided that it must be Dr. Carroll. That's the only thing that makes sense. Dr. Carroll is not a final girl. She is their therapist. She has used them for her own fame in a way. That is the theory that Lynn is working with. He agrees to help her. She just says, F that, and kicks him in the nuts, takes the keys and takes the car that they were in. So now she's in his car. She can't get a hold of anybody because everyone's pissed at her because of the book. The only place that she can think to go is to go see Stephanie, who is the new final girl, because if she is correct and someone is rounding up the final girls, then that would include Stephanie. She goes to Stephanie's parents' house, impersonates an assistant of Dr. Carroll. Her hope is that she can kidnap Stephanie before Dr. Carroll gets to her. She manages to fake out Stephanie's parents, goes into her house, and as she is trying to convince Stephanie to leave with her, Dr. Carroll shows up. They try to prevent her from leaving. She convinces Stephanie to go with her. They feel like the only person who can answer their question is Chrissy. Chrissy has met with multiple monsters, the different monsters for each final girl. She has this weird connection / empathy for them. Lynn feels like if anyone has the key to confirming who is behind this plan to kill all the final girls, it would be her. To get to her, they have to drive to Canada. They are hoping that they can make it there before Stephanie's parents call the cops. Lynn is having Stephanie call her parents every 5 hours just to let them know, hey, I'm alive. Do not call the cops yet. We're still trying to figure this out. I highly doubt that the parents would listen to that. I mean, I know me as a parent, I would not listen to that. I am definitely calling the cops. They do manage to make it to Canada and find Chrissy, who is currently living with a monster of her own. He is essentially her pet or bodyguard. He lives with her. He roams her property, makes sure no one gets in without her say so. Lynn goes to the house by herself. This is where we see how Chrissy makes her money. Not only does she commission artwork from the monsters that are still in jail, she also collects memorabilia from the different massacres and has created a museum of sorts. It's really creepy. This entire scene, Chrissy making Lynn walk through the museum, was very creepy. I would say this is probably the creepiest part of the book and definitely the most interesting, seeing the different Easter eggs, the horror movies that each girl represents. Chrissy takes Lynn to this back room that is an office and shows her a series of emails of someone commissioning work from one of the monsters. You see on the emails that there is a code written within them, and Chrissy says that she figured it out right away. What Chrissy does is confirm it came from Dr. Carroll's computer. Lynn has proof now, okay, it is Dr. Carroll. They make it back to Chrissy's house where the monster that she lives with is bringing in the body of Stephanie, who I guess had started wandering around looking for Lynn when she didn't come back. Chrissy is allowing Lynn to leave, but her monster wants payment and says that he wants Stephanie to do with what he wants, which is just gross. But because Chrissy really empathizes with the monsters and really doesn't give a shit as long as they don't kill her, she just says, sorry Lynn, this is the debt you have to pay for the information and you just gotta leave her here and let him do what he wants with her. You can go though. Lynn leaves and you initially think, oh shit, is she gonna do this again? Is she leaving again? But no, she goes and gets the car and runs the car into the house. This severely injures the monster, but kills Chrissy. It's almost like Lynn has a full-on existential breakdown because of it. She never killed her monster. let alone anyone. She just has a breakdown and is saying, I can't believe I did this. For as long as I live, no one needs to die. I'm going to guarantee that no one dies, not even the bad guy. This was such a switch in her character. You have built this character where day in and day out, she has exercised, she has built herself up, she has taught herself how to use guns, as inefficient as she is at those. It's weird that you would set up this character and then have her do a complete 180. It was a little jarring. It was not something I expected, and quite honestly made me like her even less. Lynn and Stephanie leave Chrissy's and they start driving back to the States. Lynn is trying to get a hold of anybody to warn them about Dr. Carroll. No one answers her, but then she is able to get a hold of Sky because he had left his number with her. And here's the scene. Lynn doesn't have her own phone. She is using Stephanie's phone. She calls Sky and he answers with, "What happened?" There is a pause. And Lynn goes, "Sky." And then there's a longer pause. And she goes, "It's Lynette." And he goes, "Oh yeah, no, I know." Immediately I went, oh, Stephanie is in on it. And it's not Dr. Carroll, it's Sky. Sky is the monster and Stephanie is helping him. Why would he answer a phone number he doesn't know with what happened? He had Stephanie's number in his phone. That was why he answered the way he did. And I caught that immediately. Lynn asks Sky what is going on. He says that his mom, Dr. Carroll, is rounding up all the final girls of the support group and is taking them to like this retreat that she owns. Lynn was worried that that was what was going to happen. She tells Sky to make sure that that doesn't happen, but he was like, oh no, but like she's kind of jazzed about it and blah, blah, blah. She hangs up with him. She tries calling people again, and finally Julia answers, and she is pissed because not only is she mad about the book, but she's mad that Lynn left her to die after being shot up in her apartment. Julia hears Lynn out. I feel like ultimately believes her. Lynn basically tells her, you know, you don't even need to tell me where you're going, but you need to not go with Dr. Carroll. If you can, take Sky and Pax with you. This is a weird request because even if Dr. Carroll is the monster, what indicators has she given that she would kill her children? It's laughable because Sky is 26. He is an adult. I don't think that that is even an issue. But Pax is 8 years old. There is no indication that even if Dr. Carroll was the monster, that she would kill her own child. This request is supposed to make Lynn come off as sympathetic and wanting to save the kids and maybe turning a new leaf because both the kids are male. It just doesn't seem realistic to me. Julia agrees to this. Lynn says, well, are you going to tell me? And she's like, well, no, because you told me not to, and that way you're not a liability. Lynn goes, yeah, cool. All right, great. And hangs up with Julia. And then she digs in her bag and finds the comic book that Pax had given to her when she was at Dr. Carroll's house. She flips through the pages absentmindedly, sees drawings in there created by Pax. There is a monster and it is called Sky. And this is when Lynn realizes that, oh no, it's not Dr. Carroll, it's her son, Sky.
He's a murderer. But he's kind of cute.
He admitted to Lynn that he had set up all of the emails and the computer network for his mom's business, which is another issue altogether, because if you are a doctor dealing with sensitive patient information, you should not be allowing your son to have access to your email and computer database with all of that information. Ultimately, that's how he was able to do all of this. Now, Lynn is working under the assumption that it is Sky. She tells Stephanie this. Now, Lynn is trying desperately to get a hold of the group again. Julia is not answering because I think she took Lynn's suggestion to heart and isn't going to tell her where they are going. As they're rushing back to get to Los Angeles to hopefully intervene. There are instances where Stephanie is on her phone, texting. The implication is that, oh, maybe she's still in contact with her parents. But at this point, because I knew that she was the accomplice, I was like, oh, she's texting Sky. I have notes like, this is Sky. She's letting him know what's going on and is giving him the heads up. They are almost back to LA, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to get a hold of the group because they really don't know where to go. Stephanie suggests tracking down Danny. Maybe they chose the ranch to go to. Lynn agrees. They decide to go to the ranch, but she said, oh, I don't know where it is. Yeah, but she rescues horses, right? I can Google her. She does that. They find the address. They go to the ranch. They find Danny. Danny is pissed. Danny attacks Lynn, rightfully so. It becomes a situation where Lynn is trying to convince Danny to come with her to get the rest of the group to save them. Danny knows where they went. They went to Camp Red Lake. Lynn convinces Danny. They take her truck and they head to Camp Red Lake. Right before they get there, they pull off. That is when Stephanie makes her move, attacks Lynn. She, I believe, hits her with a sledgehammer. Lynn falls out of the truck. Then Stephanie takes a gun, tries to kill Danny. Danny manages to get away. Lynn plays dead, much like what she did when her family was killed. She hates the fact that she has to do this again, but she knows that she's good at it. Hey, it works again. Stephanie takes the truck and heads up to the camp. Lynn has to decide if she's just going to stay where she's at or get up and try to help/warn the people up at the camp. She does get up. She runs through the woods, makes it back up to the camp, but she's already too late because when she arrives, she sees Danny's truck is there, which means Stephanie is there. She is pretty sure that Sky is here already. A few of the camp staff have been killed. Lynn finds Julia, and then they run into Danny, who had pulled herself through the woods. They all run towards the cabins. On their way, they run into Marilyn and Heather. They see across the way this man running in tactical gear with this assault rifle. He is starting to take shots at them. They realize they've been seen. Lynn screams at them to run to the cabin. They're like, it's wood. What's that gonna do? They listen to Lynn. They get into the cabin, and then Lynn pulls a switch. These metal plates fall down, reinforce the cabin. You learned that Lynn had come to take a couple courses from Adrienne when she ran the camp to try and help with her paranoia. Part of the agreement is that she told Adrienne that she needed to make a reinforced cabin where she would feel safe to be there, and that's what this is. The guy runs up, he's shooting at the cabin, he can't get through, he gets frustrated, he walks away. There are still camp staff out that are vulnerable and will be killed. So she decides to run out and distract the killer. She leaves the cabin and runs. It really feels like to me that Grady Hendrix was trying to make Lynn a martyr in this moment. I just wasn't buying it. She runs through these buildings and the guy is chasing her. This guy gets Lynn cornered and Lynn is pretty sure she is about to die. And then Heather, surprise, surprise, arrives and hits Sky on his head. He falls into the room, but before they can leave, Stephanie arrives with a gun and is pointing it at Heather. Lynn feels like she can maybe talk their way out of this with Stephanie because, again, she's refusing to kill anybody. She's talking to her, distracts her enough where she can grab the gun, knock her down, and pin her down. Keeps her pinned down until the cops arrive. The cops arrive. They arrest Sky. They arrest Stephanie. You know, now that I think about it, I don't know if they arrest Sky. If Sky died because of his injuries, I'm not 100% sure. Although I feel like because how crazy Lynn was about not wanting to kill anybody, I'm sure it would been mentioned, so I'm pretty sure Sky got arrested too. So we're just gonna go with that assumption. Everyone lives except for the few people who didn't. All the final girls live. Danny, although, is also now in a wheelchair, same as Julia. Lynn took a pretty bad beating as well and now has to walk with a cane. Flash forward a little bit with them and they are all meeting at a corrections facility. They are there to meet with Stephanie to essentially force her to join the final girl support group. It's such a bizarre ending because they are forcing her and it almost feels like a form of punishment. The cops are making her sit in this visitor room so they can have their group session. It's bizarre. The book ends on this note of a lot of times the monsters can also be victims, and so we need to be mindful of that and be forgiving of the monsters when they are also the victims, because Stephanie was also a victim. No. You can apologize for you. You can apologize for yourself to move on. You don't have to apologize to absolve the monster for doing that to you. No amount of victimhood will erase the bad that you've done. If you are a murderer and you've had a crappy childhood, that crappy childhood does not negate the fact that you were still a murderer. That just feels like such a dangerous statement to put out there. Get closure for yourself. Fine. Forgive if that is what it takes for you to heal as an actual victim. But you, as a victim, should not be required to absolve the monster simply because he is also a victim. I highly, highly disagree with that. It was hard for me to keep up with the characters because I feel like they weren't distinct enough in their personalities for me to actively enjoy them. To me, they weren't really fleshed out. They felt very two-dimensional. I actively started forgetting what they even looked like, and they just kind of became this mesh of one character, which is weird and shouldn't be a thing. Women are distinctive and deserve to be separate entities. And the ending of the book didn't really help with that either, because their character arcs changed so drastically or were dropped in lieu of just making them all be the same and think the same. It was a missed opportunity to not show at least some kind of friendship early on in their past, because immediately jumping into them bickering and being catty and disliking each other makes it hard for me to see past that and be like, oh yeah, these women would definitely be friends again, when I haven't even seen what that looks like. I think a good example of this, strangely enough, is the live action Scooby-Doo film, the first one, because you see in the very beginning when they are all together and they are friends, and then you see that crack, that split of them falling apart. And then years later, they all come back together. When you start with a group and they already hate each other, it doesn't make sense unless you really, really work at it that they would be friends and that would be believable. I just don't feel like the work was put into that part of the story. I wanted this group of women to be really good friends. They just weren't for each other. Lynette. I found her insufferable. I did not enjoy the fact that it was her POV that we were following for the entirety of the book. I felt there were much more interesting characters we could have followed. I don't mind following a character that is flawed or even a character that I hate as long as they are written well. I do not think Lynette was written well. Her character kept making poor choices that didn't make sense. Her character development was all over the place to the point where I didn't even know what this character was trying to do, what she wanted. A lot of the things just did not make sense as far as the character that Grady Hendrix established and then where she ends up, which made it very confusing for me to relate to the character at all. Adrienne. She was probably my favorite final girl, and it's really disappointing that we got nothing from her except word of mouth of the other final girls because she is killed off immediately. It's also a little weird that she is the only final girl that is described as a black character and she gets killed off immediately. It was something I noticed, and something that I think shouldn't have been the case. Julia. I think this character was just okay. Next to Lynn, she is probably the final girl we spend a little bit more time with. She is basically similar to all the other final girls, except that she is in a wheelchair. Danny. Danny is probably the third most final girl that we spend time with. I really liked the character, but again, there wasn't wasn't much fleshing out as far as who she was. She was basically the same as the other final girls, except she was a lesbian. Marilyn, she didn't really bother me too much, but we didn't really get a lot from her, much like the rest of the final girls. She is basically similar to all of them, except that she is rich and a socialite. Heather, next to Lynn, Heather is the most annoying final girl. A lot of the things that she did were frustrating, but at least they made sense for her character. I feel like she is similar to all the other final girls, except that she is a drug addict. Chrissy. We really only got the one scene with Chrissy, but I feel like her level of crazy was pretty spot on for the character. I actually wouldn't have minded more of her just because her level of crazy at least made the book entertaining for a bit. Dr. Carol. She is a bad doctor, an even worse mother. To be the doctor of a support group of at least 20 years and not have one success case out of it says a lot about your abilities. Stephanie. I didn't mind Stephanie too much. In fact, I only really found her intriguing when I figured out the twist in that she was the accomplice. She was a little wackadoodle. I think much like the other final girls, I wish that she had been fleshed out a little bit more. All the women really needed work as far as their writing and being able to make them distinctive from each other. Sky. He was everything that Lynn feared, and yet she ultimately trusted, which did not make sense. It is mentioned many times that she kind of has this radar to pick out these people that have these red flags that show that they're going to be a monster, and yet none of them were waving when she met Sky, when she spoke to Sky. The only time it really triggered for her was when she finally saw the comic that was created by Pax. Either Lynn is full of it and she's not as good at figuring out people as she claims, or Sky is a mastermind, but he's not. At the end, they claim is a men's rights activist, so I guess there goes that feeling that I had throughout the whole book. I also kept forgetting, like I said, that Sky was a 26-year-old man because of the way Grady Hendrix referenced him along with his brother in the book. I can't tell if that's poor writing or if that was intentional to help us forget that Sky was a 26-year-old man and potentially a threat. For the most part, this book was not enjoyable for me. I couldn't get into the characters. I really couldn't get into the story. I really thought the story was going to be something different. I mean, the premise was there. The skeletal structure of a decent story was there, and the execution went very poorly. None of the characters were really relatable, at least none of the ones that we saw and got to know. All of them were really catty to the point of ridiculousness. This book felt like it was written by a man who hasn't progressed past seeing women in a high school setting. I wish Grady Hendrix had had some sensitivity readers if this was what he was trying to focus on. I think it is good to have books that discuss women's trauma. I just don't think this was one of those books, and I think it would have been better had he maybe focused on making it a campy horror story, much like the movies that he was referencing. I think that would have made it more enjoyable if he had leaned in to the horror film element versus the true crime and trauma element of it all. Hendrix clearly knows a lot about horror movies and is clearly part of that fandom, and that shines through in the book, which I really enjoyed. However, that unfortunately is dulled by his clear lack of knowledge as far as trauma and true crime and what all of that entails. I can try and give Grady Hendrix the benefit of the doubt that this book was written purely out of ignorance. I don't think he went into this to be malicious towards women. I felt a lot of the passages were read that way. I can see others maybe taking it that way as well. As a horror fan, I really am intrigued by the trope of the final girl, and I enjoy that there are more stories coming out that dive deeper into that trope. I just don't think this book was one of the ones that did it well. I am rating the Final Girl support group 1.5 out of 5 stars. Having now read 2 books by Grady Hendrix and not enjoying either, I think I am comfortable with saying that I probably won't be reading any more of his books. We have such finite time to read certain books, and I don't want to continue reading books by an author that I am not really interested in. That being said, if you've read this book or any other Grady Hendrix novels, please let me know what your take is. Did you like the Final Girl support group? Is there one of his books you enjoyed more, and why? Dare I even ask if you think there is one more of his books I should give a chance to, and which one should that be? Please feel free to comment down below. You can reach me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm on both. Until next time, this is Witchy Reads saying, I hope you survive your horror movie.